Okay, good morning, everyone. Tonight we have the privilege of beginning the holiday of Hanukkah. And every year I'd like to review the historical background of Hanukkah, which is something that unfortunately is omitted from most curricula. And perhaps it's a good reason for it, as we'll see. When I used to teach Jewish history in college, it took a few months to tell the story of Hanukkah from a historical perspective. So we will start with a little bit of an introduction. And the Gemara has very little information about Hanukkah. Very little information. There's about a page in the entire Talmud. Shabbos, Maseches, Chaf Aleph, Amud Beis, that's about it. In the entire Talmudic literature, there's a half a page, one page. Yet, we know the story of Hanukkah, at least some parts of the story, because the rabbis did not limit themselves to only reading rabbinic texts. They knew other historical texts that were available. In Greek, they read Greek. Even though they prohibited anybody else from learning how to read Greek, they read Greek. And the question that we're going to raise is a very simple question. Where do we know the story of Hanukkah from? Where do we know about Judah Maccabee and his brothers? It's not mentioned anywhere in Shas. Where do we know about Matisyahu and his family and all the other stories about the bravery that took place? It's not mentioned in the Talmud. I defy you to find it. It is found in other books that are not considered part of the biblical canon. There are 24 books in Tanakh. There were, at the time, many other books that didn't make the cut. And in order to determine which books are considered worthy of being part of Tanakh, it makes sense that the rabbis would have read these books. There are many books from the period in which Hanukkah takes place. We're talking about the period of 167 to 165 BCE, when the actual events took place. There were many books out there. Among the books, there are 4 books known as Sefer HaMaccabim, or Sefer Chashmonoim. These are known as part of the apocryphal literature. Sforim Chitzonium, the external books. External meaning they weren't considered to be Ruach HaKodesh, they weren't considered worthy of being included in Tanakh. But the rabbis read them. 2 of those books were eyewitness accounts of what happened during the Hanukkah story, the period when Hanukkah takes place. And that's where most of our information comes from. It also comes from certain Greek writers who are around at the time. And you have a number of very non-Jewish sources or non-accepted as canonical sources that the rabbis read, but it was excluded from the story that we tell our children and the story that we know about Hanukkah. So bear that in mind, that if you go to the library, Google it online, the book of the Maccabees. The first 2 books of the Maccabees, I encourage you to read. The first 2 are eyewitness accounts of what happened. Very historic. The other 2 books are not as historically accurate. The first 2 books are. It all starts, we go back a couple hundred years before Hanukkah, with a fellow named Philip of Macedon. Philip of Macedon conquered what became known as the Greek Empire and many countries in the Middle East, as well as part of Europe. And his son was a young boy named Alexander, who became known as Alexander the Great. Alexander the Great was what we call the philosopher king. He was not only a great military general and theorist, but he was also a person who was an intellectual. As a young man, Alexander studied with Aristotle. That was his Rebbe. And he was very learned. but he was also very, very interested in promoting Greek culture. So and Alexander the Great, meaning Alexander the Great Conqueror, Alexander the Great conquered most of the civilized world at that time as a young man. And he promoted Greek culture to the extent that every country that he conquered had to speak Greek. It had to be their official language. And the gods in the temples had to become Greek gods. The same statues, just give them a different name. And to promote Greek culture, he had mass weddings. He left Greek officers stationed in every town or country that he conquered, and he had them marry local women to promote Greek culture. So he was a great advocate of Greek culture. That's important to remember when we go all the way down a few generations later to what Antiochus and his followers were doing, promoting Greek culture. Alexander died, by the way, Alexander was also, despite the fact that he promoted Greek culture, he was very good to the Jews. He allowed the Jews to observe their religious customs. How do we know Alexander was good to the Jews? What's the easiest way to tell? Name. A lot of Jewish boys are named Alexander. There are Hasidim known as Alexander Hasidim. There's Alexander Rebbe is still around. So Alexander was very good to the Jews. He died very young, in his early 30s. And not everybody who came after him was as talented a general. So his empire was divided up among several generals, known as the Diadochi in Greek, because not one of them was capable as Alexander, and they couldn't run the whole empire, so they divided it up. And there, ultimately, after a lot of political struggles, we won't go through all of this, there were two families that emerged: the Seleucus family and the Ptolemy family. The Seleucus family ultimately had rule over Syria and the areas above Syria, and the Ptolemies were in Egypt and the areas around there. Israel is smack in the middle between Syria and Egypt. And the two empires were constantly fighting with one another. Ptolemies and the Seleucidians were constantly fighting with each other. Israel had a difficult choice. Every so often, they had to decide who they're going to support, the Ptolemies or the Seleucidians. If they picked the right choice, made the right choice, then the government who took over the rule of Israel would be good to them. If they picked the wrong side and they lost, then there would be harsh treatments to them. Okay, fast forward now. We're not going through every single battle in every single generation. Antiochus III, a few generations down, defeated Ptolemy for control of Israel. And Antiochus III was lucky that the Jews chose his side to support. So Antiochus III, who is the father of the Antiochus of the Hanukkah story, in gratitude to the Jews for supporting him in their battle, gave the Jews all types of exemptions from taxes. He passed a decree that pigs should not be allowed to be raised in Jerusalem. He gave them status of an ethnos, meaning they could observe their own ritual law. He was very good to the Jews. Antiochus III was very, very good. He exempted them from taxes. He did a lot of good things for them. And Josephus gives you the text of all these documents, first century historian. He was very good to the Jews. He dies, and his son, Seleucus IV, took over after him, tried to add battles, etc., etc. And he didn't change too much about what his father did. Power, and there are many, by the way, while this is happening, there were power struggles among the Jews. And a very important thing that we have to remember is that Hanukkah is not so much a battle of the Greek Syrians against the Jews. It's a battle of Jew against Jew. Because part of this pro-Greek attitude was to dress like Greeks, to speak Greeks, and many Jews felt that if we become Greek in our cultural outlook, we'll get better jobs. We will become part of the administration. We'll do better economically. So many Jews became assimilated Greeks under Seleucus IV and under Antiochus IV. Antiochus was a person who believed in spreading Greek culture, and he wanted to imitate Alexander the Great, and therefore he clamped down on the Jews to make them more Greek-like. The Jews that became more Greek-like in their dress, in their language, in their behavior, were rewarded. The Jews who were traditionalists were kind of marginalized. And internally, the struggle was going on between the assimilationists and the traditional Jews. And a lot of this is played out in the book of Maccabees, in Josephus, and other contemporary sources. Part of the problem was that this assimilation creeped into the Beis HaMikdash itself. And this is the scary part, and this is what people don't understand. The Beis HaMikdash became what I'm looking for. It became a tool for assimilation. So much so that the office of the high priest, the Kohen Gadol, was basically achieved by individuals who bribed the Syrian governor for the position. Instead of going according to Yichus, you look in Tanakh, there are certain families that have the Yichus of becoming Kohen Gadol. By the way, Matisyahu was not part of that family structure. It's a separate discussion. The Kohanim, the Kohen Gadol bribed his way to become, and there's a whole, if you Google Jason and Menelaus, two brothers who fought in the Beis HaMikdash, there's a lot of fighting, but again, it's intramural fighting. It's Jew against Jew. They bribed the governor to become Kohen Gadol. The real Kohanim were frustrated, but even the high priests and even the Kohanim in the Beis HaMikdash became assimilated. And I'll give you the worst example of it all. What's a major part of Greek culture? Athletics, the Olympic Games. How did they perform all of their games in ancient Greece? They were naked. Okay? Jewish boys, if they participated in this event, will be obviously known that they were Jewish because they were circumcised. Book of Maccabees describes in horrible detail Kohanim, in order to participate in the athletic games, where all they wore was the patassos, the little hat of Mercury with the wings on it. That's what they wore in the Olympic Games. They underwent very painful surgery to hide the fact they were circumcised in order to participate in the Greek Games. Kohanim. Traditional Jews were obviously very upset about that. Again, fighting was going on. If you look at the words in the Al Hanisim prayer, all the negative words were not so much about the Greeks, it was about the assimilationist Jews. Zaydim biadoske torasecha. Zaydim is a word that's used for a Jew who doesn't observe. And all the other words, Rabbim bi'atim, Tmeim bi'atahorim, it's not necessarily referring to the Greeks or the Jews. So that civil war was going on. Yeah.
We learned that if the Kohen Gadol did anything wrong in the Kaddish culture, he would die in Yom Kippur. So how did all these, come with those, survive year?
Good question. I don't have an answer for that.
They had a new one every year.
Huh?
Maybe every year they had a
Maybe they had a new Kohen every year.
It's their ego.
Ego is a very,
Ego's a destruction.
it's a very good question. It's a very good question. I don't recall that. I'd have to go back and check. I don't recall.
What's the question?
The question is, if a Kohen Gadol did something wrong on Yom Kippur, he would die. So what happened to these guys? Again, it's a very good question. The only answer I can suggest is that it probably because of what they were doing, and because they were illegitimate in terms of being in the role of Kohen Gadol, the status of the Kodesh Kodashim and the Beis Hamikdash was probably degraded to the point that a lot of the things that would have happened normally did not take place.
How many years are we talking about that they have control, that they were able to do?
Oh, you're talking about 25, 30 years.
So that's not a real
No, no.
time. I mean, we talk about 30 different people.
Okay, but when the Greeks finally were able to totally convert the Beis Hamikdash into a Beis Avodah Zarah, that's when the rebellion broke out. And they said, Ad Kedei Kach, we can't accept this anymore. And Matisyahu and his sons and other traditionalist Jews, they left the Beis Hamikdash, they left Yerushalayim, and they began basically a guerrilla war against the Syrian Greek government. Again, Greece was far away. It was Syria that was controlling everything. But the Greek garrison was stationed in Syria. So it's Syrian Greeks, not so much Greeks. And Antiochus was a very unbalanced person himself. He wanted to become known as not only a great leader, but also he was very smart in one area. He saw that the influence of Greece was going down. Who was coming up? Rome. So he wanted to kowtow to Rome. And part of that is to show Rome, I am a great leader, and I'm not going to let these Jews tell me how to run the city of Jerusalem and the country of Judea. So he clamped down on them. And that's when the rebellion, again, Jew against Jew, more than Jew against Syrian. But in order to get the Jews who are assimilationists out of power, you have to defeat the Syrian army, the Syrian garrison, and then the war is described in great, great detail in the book of Maccabees. First two books of Maccabees, I urge you to read. Now, and I am condensing a lot of information. There are a lot of very good books out there by Bickerman, by Cherikover, that give you the historical background of quoting from Greek and Roman sources who were eyewitnesses to this. The battle has now emerged. The traditional Jews were basically outnumbered, outgunned, so to speak. They didn't have, and they were farmers. They weren't soldiers. They were religious people. And part of being religious means being Shomer Shabbos. And if you're Shomer Shabbos, you don't fight on Shabbos. So they were hiding in a cave. And the Syrian Greek soldiers found them. And they killed them all. They built a fire. They wouldn't fight back because it was Shabbos. And they all died. A large group. Based on that event, Matisyahu Paskind, Pikuach Nefesh Doches HaShabbos, in terms of war, not just illness, and we can fight on Shabbos. Otherwise, what would happen? Every enemy would attack Jews on Shabbos. No, they wouldn't fight back. So he said, from now on, we fight on Shabbos. That's the origin of that particular halach. They attacked small groups. They attacked at night. They attacked stealthily. It was guerrilla war. Okay. The five sons of Yehuda, of Matisyahu, Kohanim, apparently, and this would fly in the face of some people might believe, all five of those boys were Kohanim. They were allowed to eat truma, but none of them could actually serve in the Beis Hamikdash because each of them had a physical disability. And if you look in the original Greek, the book of Maccabees was originally written in Greek. One was called Gadi, Tassi. They're different. One was what had very bushy eyebrows. One guy limped. What was Yehuda's disability? He was a makban. A makban. Mem, kuf, bet, nun. A makban is what we call today a macrocephalic, where a protruding forehead and the back of his head might stick out. It's called a macrocephalic. It's a misshapen skull. We've seen people like that. Nice guy, wonderful person, but he couldn't, as a Kohen has to be a perfect physical specimen. All right? You can see how the word makban is spelled. Mem kuf bet nun. Sometimes the nun can get shortened and becomes a yud. Makbi or Maccabi. So he was known as Yehuda the Mallet head, the hammerhead. That's what his head looked like. Now his other brothers had other nicknames. Okay? And to say Micha Mocha Ba'elam Hashem, Mem Chuf Bet Yud is wrong. There's no Chuf in Greek. It's a Kuf, it's a Kappa. So that was his original name. In any event, there's a lot of misinformation that became, accepted. So they had the fights. They won a lot of battles because they attacked. Let's say there was guerrilla warfare, and Antiochus was getting very, very frustrated because it was looking bad in the eyes of the upcoming Romans, and he couldn't control that little country of Judea. Fast forward, and I'm skipping a lot of the battles, a lot of great, great battles. The Jews are strengthened by the fact that they were having so many victories against the Syrian Greeks. And they're approaching now the Beis HaMikdash. They've defeated many garrisons. They defeated the soldiers. Very often when you have an army that is outgunned and outnumbered, but they have tremendous ruach, they have tremendous will to win because they have nothing to lose. So sometimes that compensates for their lack of military might, so to speak. And this is what happened to the Hashmonaim or the Maccabim, whatever you want to call them, the Jewish traditionalists who defeated the assimilationists, and they defeated the Syrian Greek army after many, many battles. So here they are surging up Har HaBayis. They're coming up Har HaBayis to claim back the Beis HaMikdash. There were 7 Syrian Greek guards on duty on top of the Beis HaMikdash. They see this horde coming up like a tsunami. They drop their spears and they leave. Jews get to the top of Har HaBayis. They reclaim the Beit HaMikdash like in 67, Hakotel B'Yadenu. They retrieve those 7 swords. They have 7 swords or 8 swords in the case. I think it was 8 swords. Yeah, it must have been 8 swords. 8 swords. They made torches out of those 8 swords, and they waved them to everybody below in the city, and we have now reconquered the Beis HaMikdash. The Gemara tells us, which also they must have read Sefer Maccabim, the first menorah in the rededicated Beis HaMikdash was made from those 8 spears. 8 spears. 8 spears. 8 steel spears. They made the first menorah out of those spears. This is a very important fact that most people are unaware. The menorah in the Beis HaMikdash was made from those 8 spears. Well, yeah, the base, and then there's 7-branch menorah. The base, so it says that they had 8 spears. One was for the base, the middle, and then you had to hold it together, the base. So there were 7 spears for the 7-branch menorah. All right. So the first menorah was made from those spears. And it's interesting, by the way, just on a side note, there's a machlokes between the Rambam and Rashi. What did the menorah in the Beis HaMikdash look like? Was it the way Chabad makes their menorahs, straight up? Or was it circular, the way it appears in most drawings and the way it looks like in the Arch of Titus in Rome? And Chabad got it right, I think. I think the Rambam was correct. Chabad follows the Rambam. If you believe, as the Gemara says, the first menorah was made from those spears, then they would be straight, not curved, which is probably the way that the original menorah looked like. Fascinating historical detail, a little interesting footnote. And then the Gemara, the Gemara that talks about these spears does not mention it in terms of Hanukkah. It mentions that there is a prohibition. And I don't understand. There are many shuls that have decorations of 7-branch menorahs. It's contrary to the halacha. You're not allowed to imitate any kalim of the base of Mikdash. You can't make anything that looks like what they have, which is why you can't make a 7-branch menorah. And then they say, because in the base of Mikdash, and they mentioned the first menorah was made from those spears, and then when they got settled, they fixed it up. They made it out of silver, then out of gold, and then over a period of time. But the original one was those spears. Okay. Now this is meant. Now the whole story of Hanukkah is limited to 2 lines, really, in Gemara. The 25th day of Kislev, the Jews were victorious over the Greeks, and they built this menorah, and it lasted for 8 days, and that's why we celebrate Hanukkah. That's all it says. Now, this quotation is from a book called Megillas Tanis, a book by Sheni, which includes all the days that we celebrate. We don't say Tachanun, you can't have a spade. And in the Perush on Megillas Tanis, it brings down this medrash of Psikta Rabbasi, which is one of our medrashim, which quotes the story of the 7 spears, which is recorded in the Gemara in 3 different places, not in terms of Hanukkah, but in terms of imitating the menorah. Okay? This is very much Bekitzur, and we need much more time to go into all these details. Maybe we'll finish it tomorrow. Why is Hanukkah 8 days? So you could say the 8 spears that they found, one reason. You could say that all the Kohanim who were fighting in the Beis HaMikdash were Tameh, right? They were in battle. So how long does it take to become Tahor? It takes 7 days plus 1 day to go to Mikvah. You got another 8 days. Okay? The oil, we don't find anywhere that I could find that the oil of the Beis HaMikdash has to have a seal of the Kohen Gadol, which is the basic part of the story. They can use any oil. They used to go to a place called Tekoa. And by the way, Tosfos on the spot raises the question, why do they have to wait to find a cruse of oil with the sign of the Kohen Gadol? There's a halacha, tu b'hutra b'tzibur. Tosfos raises that kasha. They could have used that regular oil to light the menorah, to re-establish the avodah, the Beis HaMikdash. Tekoa was 4 days' journey away from Yerushalayim, but it had the best olive oil. 4 days going, 4 days. No, there's a sefer, came out about 200 years ago, which lists several hundred reasons why Hanukkah has to be 8 days long. We know about the miracle of the oil, but there are many, many other reasons. Why is the miracle of the oil promoted so much? And why is the entire story left out? Because what happened to the Chashmonaim after they regained the Beis HaMikdash? What happened to them? They became kings. But the same guy who was the king, the son of Matisyahu, Shimon, was also the Kohen Gadol. Well, you can't be both. You can't be Kohen and Melech. It's against Allah, but they did. And what happened 2 generations later to the Chashmonaim? They became Sadducees, who denied the validity of Torah Shebaal Peh. The very people who fought to maintain Torah tradition were ultimately became opposed to it. And that's why you have no Maseches Chanukah, because the rabbis were opposed to Tzdukim. Very, very violent clashes. Obviously, you don't want to praise people for subverting Torah Shebaal Peh. So that whole story was eliminated. And all you have is a little story about the cruse of oil. All you have left of the Hanukkah story in the Gemara. But they knew all the other stuff. They just felt, you know what? These guys are out of the picture. Yeah.
How can they become Kohen Gadol and serve the Beis HaMikdash if they don't have homes?
They didn't. The sons, I mean, it was contrary to halacha, first of all, that the one of them did it.
What's the question? What's the question?
How could somebody who had a mum serve as Kohen Gadol in the Beis Hamikdash at a blemish?
Well, how did they serve? You said they were kind of awkward, pointy-headed or something. So how did they become Kohen Gadol?
Because they did. I mean, how did they do it? Because when you're in charge, no one's going to buck you on it. They shouldn't have been. They shouldn't. And even if they wanted to become Melech, you can't do both. These are totally separate roles. And which is why the rabbis were very much opposed, because power is very intoxicating. They beat the Syrian Greeks, hoo-ha. Now we can do whatever we want. Now, one other thing, very important. How long did it take to get the Beis Hamikdash ready? People think they came up and they lit the menorah and poof, everything is hunky-dory and back to the way it was originally. Again, go back to Megillas Tanis. Megillas Tanis tells us on the 23rd day of Cheshvan, which was a few weeks ago, the 23rd day of Cheshvan, they tore down the Sorego. Sorego was a partition that they used for Zdus and other Avodah Zarah things in the Beis HaMikdash, the Greeks. The process of cleaning the Beis HaMikdash took about a month. It didn't happen overnight. They started cleaning it up. They began offering korbanos. They began fixing up all the others. It took a while to do. So that's number one. It didn't happen. It took about a month to clean the Beis HaMikdash. That's number one. Number two, very, very important. In the Beis Hamikdash, we have several historical precedents. The word Hanukkah itself, the word Hanukkah in our context does not mean dedication. It means rededication. Very important distinction. When Moshe Rabbeinu built the Mishkan and he dedicated the Mikdash, how long did that dedication party take? No, 7 days. 7 days. When Shlomo HaMelech dedicated the first Beis HaMikdash, how long was his dedication party? 7 days. When you dedicate it from scratch, it was a 7-day, and they knew the Tanakh at least. In Novi, you see when the Assyrians attacked the Beis HaMikdash, and they almost destroyed it, but they just messed things up inside. When the Novi rededicated the Beis HaMikdash, rededicated it, how long was his rededication party? 8 days. So there's an historical precedent, another reason for 8 days of Hanukkah. Okay? There's a lot of very important historical data.
Rabbi,
Yes.
what about the whole thing about, that it's supposed to the 8 days to parallel the Korbanot, with Sukkot?
Good, good. Very good. I will conclude with that particular halacha. The first Hanukkah in the year 165 BCE, the first Hanukkah was a tashlumin, a makeup for Sukkot. Because where were the Hashmonaim during Sukkot of that year? They were fighting in the hills and the mountains. When they rededicate, and look at Sefer, again, go back to Sefer Maccabim. When they rededicated the Beis HaMikdash, they had torchlights, they had lulavim, hadassim, aravos, and esrogim. And they had the korbanos of Sukkot that they offered starting on Chafei Kislev. The first Hanukkah was celebrated like so. And by the way, in Yemenite and in Roman communities, I think even to this day, on Sukkot, they hang hadassim on the walls to remind you that the first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot. Many years ago, I was in Yerushalayim for Hanukkah, and they opened up the tunnels under the hotel, and about 1/3 of the way in to the tunnels under the hotel, they had like a little prayer area, and there was a big menorah there, and on the menorah somebody had hung Hadassah, the picture of it. To remember this, the first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot. Okay? Another reason, perhaps, for 8 days. Okay? If you Echmini Etzeres into it. Josephus tells us, how was Hanukkah celebrated immediately after the victory, 165? How was it celebrated? He tells us, and it's in the Sefer Maccabim as well. They had torchlight parades throughout Jerusalem. Not only did they carry torches to symbolize those first torches they built when the victory took place, they marched through the streets of Yerushalayim with lulavim, hadassim, esrogim, and aravos to remember that the first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot. They did that. Who came in for a short period of time in between the Greeks and the Romans to rule Yerushalayim? The Persians. Who did the Persians worship? Zoroaster. They were Zoroastrians. If you look at Rashi, Gemara Shabbos, Chaf Aleph Amud Beis, when they're discussing where do you put the menorah, we'll talk about the origin of the menorah very quickly. We'll finish with that. He said, normally you put the menorah in a place where it can be seen, Presume Nisa, the windows outside Yerushalayim, and more in America today, people are starting to like the menorahs outside the doors instead of inside, where originally it was done. But how was it originally done? And then torchlight parades. The Zoroastrians came into power, Rashi tells us, that you weren't allowed to have any fire burning publicly except in their base of Avodah Zarah. Shasa Sakana. Sakana. If you lit a torch and marched to celebrate Hanukkah, they would kill you because it occurs around the winter solstice, and that's when they had their celebrations. You can't have any fire publicly. So what happened to Hanukkah celebration? No more torchlight parades. It went from a public celebration indoors. And that's where your Chanukiah was born. That's when the Chanukiah was born. And then you have a machlokas, Beis Hillel and Beis Shammai. Now already, we are indoors with our menorah. How do you light it? 876-54321 or 134-567. All right, so fascinating. Read that Gemara. Chaf Aleph Amud Beis in Shabbos. Ultimately, we paskin like Beis Hillel. We say Malin b'kodesh ve'ein moridin. You go up. The miracle lasted longer and longer. Go up. Beis Shammai says no. 876-5432. Nothing to do with the miracle. It's a sukkah sacrifices. How are the sukkah sacrifices offered?
Started with 13.
13, 12, 11, 10, 9, you go in descending order. We don't have public celebrations anymore. All we have are indoor celebrations. But at least remember the origin, the first Hanukkah was celebrated like Sukkot.
Chabad does it at City Hall or Town Hall or on the National Lawn.
In terms of Shas HaSakana, and this happens throughout Jewish history, when it was difficult for Jews, if they would light the menorah, people would see it, it would cause problems. I remember when the Bronx was changing from a very Jewish neighborhood to a mixed neighborhood, so many people would light the menorah not in the window, but in their houses, indoors. That's just, and today, in certain communities, given what's going on in Israel, it's also a problem. Also a problem. All right, last thing, and then we'll end. Rav Tzvi Hirsch Chayes, great Galiciana Gadol, 19th century, his Perushim or Shas, he wrote many, he was also very interested in history and scientific approach to Talmud. And in his Perush on the Gemara and Shabbos, he raises an interesting question. Only one to my knowledge that raises this question. If you say that the reason for the 8 days was because of the 8 spears that they found, how does that jive with the miracle of the 8 days of the oil burning? How do you balance the two? So his answer was, the miracle of the oil took place in that menorah made out of the 8 spears. That was, anyhow, it's a fascinating, fascinating story. We've only touched Rashi Prakim. Tomorrow, we'll focus on the role of women in the Hanukkah story. A lot of interesting stuff. We'll talk about that. But again, I urge you, read the first 2 books of Maccabees. It'll give you a whole different approach to the historical basis of Hanukkah.
So we'll leave the topic the same, right?
Huh?
The topic is the same for tomorrow?
Yeah.
Thank you.
Have a good day, everybody. Stay warm.
Thank you, Wally. Feel better. You okay?
Thank you. Everything's
better?
good.
Good, thank
All
God.
better.
Have a happy, if not happy, make it a freilich Hanukkah.
A
One or
lift
two.
again, and a lift again.
A lick again. All the best.
Thank you, Wally.
Don't eat too many lots. Okay. Have a sign of Hashem, Allah, Shiur's doing kan, Baruch Shechal Shalom, Baruch Shechal Shalom, Kulo Chayinu, Uno Sin Lechem, Umetil Kol Mechim Bazon Chol B'Yosov Asher Bara, Baruch Ato Adonai Hazon Yisakol.
Yeah.
V'al hakom. Baruch ato Adonai al ha'aretz v'al hamazon. Yerushalayim ir hakodesh me'era v'yameinu. Baruch ato Adonai b'nei berachamo v'Yerushalayim. Amen.
Remember to get the menorah ready and the candles.
Baruch Hu v'Yallah Chasreinu.